This video looks at the nervous system and is part of homeostasis, looking at control and coordination. So obviously the nervous system is an important and complex part of controlling and coordinating body actions and cell functions. So let's have a look in detail. So like other ways of coordinating and controlling, the nervous system works by cell-to-cell signaling. Now in general, cell-to-cell signaling requires the secreting cell to secrete some sort of chemical messenger that will affect target cells. Now, the evolution of this obviously is even from single-celled organisms communicating with each other, but then when multicellular organisms evolved, the cells within there needed to communicate with each other. But in a multicellular organism, you have the issue that the secreting cell might be a long way away from the target cell. And because as they diffuse through the extracellular fluid, the signaling molecules become more and more diffuse, this cell cannot rely on diffusion to signal to this cell. So the way the nervous system has evolved to create a solution to this is that the cell actually isn't just here. The cell has a small part of it that comes all the way over here, and this is where the release happens. And so in the case of the nervous system, we call this part of the cell the axon, with a synaptic terminal where the chemical messenger is released close to the target cell, allowing diffusion to just do that last little step. This is in contrast to the hormonal system, where the two cells are separated by the circulatory system, and so the diffusion of the chemical from one then enters that circulatory system, allowing diffusion to the target cell and other target cells that are connected to the circulatory system. So the nervous system has this special adaptation to have one part of the cell that's very long, so that the communication can happen directly and locally, even if the two cells are quite far apart. And this is represented here in terms of this being the axon and the nerve terminal to the target cell, and this being that difference that we see with the hormonal system. So obviously the anatomy is quite complex. These are simplified diagrams, but the nervous system relies on these special cells that have this long axon, nerve cells or neurons. They have dendrites around the cell body, and the action potential, or the electrical signaling that travels down the axon starts here, the axon hillock. It's made faster by the myelin sheath that protects around that axon, and then the synapse, this point here, is where the chemical signaling happens. This cell will have many synapses on it, and if the threshold is reached, it will then fire its own action potential down its axon. Different types of neuron exist in different parts of the body and do different functions. So motor neurons are an example of a cell which sends a signal from the cell body to the terminals, and the terminals will often be on muscles, and so this is why they're called motor neuron, because they are moving muscles around the place. And these tend to come from the brain or spinal cord, and then connect through one or two connections down to muscles at the other end. Interneurons are neurons that communicate within the nervous system. So they might have one nerve cell connects to the dendrites of this interneuron, and then it connects to other nerve cells. And the third type we have here are the sensory neurons. They tend to have their cell body in the middle, pick up sensory information through dendrites, heat, pressure, chemical signals, and then send that message into the nervous system through their axons. And so the way the actions work is that here in yellow we have the chemical signals that are coming out and diffusing across to that membrane, and that creates an electrical signal which, if it's strong enough, will then cause the action potential to travel down here. When we say an electrical signal, we're not talking about the flow of electrons here. What we're talking about is changes in the potential across the membrane caused by ions coming in and out, and it creates this wave of electrical potential that travels down the axon. The wave of electrical potential, once it meets the terminal here, will change the membrane properties again, or change the local environment, so that these vesicles will fuse with the membrane. So this is a classic process of exocytosis. The vesicles are filled with neurotransmitter, which is that chemical signal, and when neurotransmitter binds to the receptors on the postsynaptic cell, those channels open, allow ions to flow in to the postsynaptic cell, which creates, again, this wave of electrical potential that travels through the cell. So it's all about opening and closing channels to allow ions to change the electrical potential. That wave of electrical potential travels very quickly, much quicker than diffusion would, and allows signaling to reach the terminal of that signaling cell. So let's put it all together then. So here we have examples of sensory neurons. The purple and green ones are interneurons, and the red one is a motor neuron. So when we have our feedback loop mechanism, we have a stimulus, the receptor being a sensory neuron here detecting a light. That may go to the brain for some processing and decision making about what is it that I'm looking at, and lead to an action that has been thought through. Or if the stimulus is an acute noxious one, is that in order to save time, we might just go through the spinal cord and have a reflex action, which is rapid and involuntary, doesn't require conscious thought, and is a much quicker response. In this case, lifting the glass would go through the decision making, but if this was a noxious stimulus, like how your finger was burning, your arm might jerk up through a reflex arc instead.